Hi, class. Welcome to the second part of chapter 10. In my version, we are on page 43. That's where I left off previously. We're reading Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Um, we had a very important scene where Douglass fights back against Covey. Um, and this is super important. This whole scene, this is a turning point for him. And he says, "You've seen so far how a man became a slave. Now you'll see how a slave became a man or becomes a man." Okay, he's taking back his humanity by fighting back to Covey. And the line we ended with is the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. So he's not going to let himself be whipped again. "From this time I was never again what might be called fairly whipped, though I remained a slave 4 years afterward. I had several fights, but was never whipped. It was for a long time a matter of surprise to me why Mr. Covey did not immediately have me taken by the constable to the whipping post. A constable is a police officer, and there regularly whipped for the crime of raising my hand against a white man in defense of myself. And the only explanation I can now think of does not entirely satisfy me, but such as it is, I will give it." So he's going to explain why he thinks Mr. Covey doesn't have him punished. "Mr. Covey enjoyed the most unbounded reputation for being a first-rate overseer and Negro breaker. It was of considerable importance to him. That reputation was at stake, and had he sent me, a boy about 16 years old, to the public whipping post, his reputation would have been lost. So, to save his reputation, he suffered me to go unpunished. My term of actual service to Mr. Edward Covey ended on Christmas Day, 1833. The days between Christmas and New Year's Day are allowed as holidays, and accordingly we were not required to perform any labor more than to feed and take care of the stock. This time was regarded as our own by the grace of our masters, and we therefore used or abused it nearly as we pleased. Those of us who had families at a distance were generally allowed to spend the whole 6 days in their society. This time, however, was spent in various ways. The staid, sober, thinking, and industrious ones of our number would employ themselves in making corn brooms, mats, horse collars, and baskets, and another class of us would spend time in hunting possums, hares, and coons. But by far the larger part engaged in such sports and merriments as playing ball, wrestling, running foot races, fiddling, dancing, and drinking whiskey. And this latter means the last in the list, this latter mode of spending the time was by far the more agreeable to the feelings of our masters." Okay, so we find out between Christmas and New Year's, they get time off to do what they want. And he says that the masters like it most when the slaves are drinking whiskey and then running around, dancing, having fun. So let's find out why Douglass says that. "A slave who would work during the holidays was considered by our masters as scarcely deserving them. He was regarded as one who rejected the favor of his master. It was deemed a disgrace not to get drunk at Christmas, and he was regarded as lazy indeed who had not provided himself with the necessary means during the year to get whiskey enough to last him through Christmas." Kind of weird, but the slave masters seem to think, oh, well, if you're working during the holidays, then you must not really need the time off. "From what I know of the effect of these holidays upon the slave, I believe them to be among the most effective means in the hands of the slaveholder in keeping down the spirit of insurrection." Insurrection is rising up and rebelling against whoever's in charge. So Douglass is saying that letting slaves just get drunk between Christmas and New Year's is actually like a strategic thing that the slaveholders do to avoid slaves rising up. "Were the slaveholders at once to abandon this practice, I have not the slightest doubt it would lead to an immediate insurrection among the slaves. These holidays serve as conductors or safety valves to carry off the rebellious spirit of enslaved humanity. But for these, the slave would be forced up to the wildest desperation, and woe betide the slaveholder the day he ventures to remove or hinder the operation of those conductors. I warn him that in such an event, a spirit will go forth in their midst more to be dreaded than the most appalling earthquake." So he calls it a safety valve. A safety valve, when we're talking about like mechanics and things, a safety valve is there to release pressure. So pressure is building in some container, you twist the safety valve to release some of that pressure, and that stops it from exploding under pressure. So this letting the slaves get drunk is a safety valve. It stops the pressure that's been building all year, the frustration against their masters, against slavery, having this like week and a half to just or week to just be wild and let out all their frustrations. Douglass says is a safety valve. The holidays are part and parcel of the gross fraud, wrong, and inhumanity of slavery. They are professedly a custom established by the benevolence of the slaveholders. But I undertake to say it is the result of selfishness and one of the grossest frauds committed by upon the downtrodden slave. They do not give the slaves this time because they would not like to have their work during its continuance, but because they know it would be unsafe to deprive them of it. This will be seen by the fact that the slaveholders like to have their slaves spend those days just in such a manner as to make them as glad of their ending as of their beginning. The objection seems to be to disgust their slaves with freedom by plunging them into the lowest depths of dissipation. For instance, the slaveholders not only like to see the slave drink of his own accord, but will adopt various plans to make him drunk. One plan, to make bets on their slaves as to who can drink the most whiskey without getting drunk. And in this way, they succeed in getting whole multitudes to drink to excess. Thus, when the slave asks for virtuous freedom, the cunning or sneaky slaveholder, knowing his ignorance, cheats him with a dose of vicious dissipation, artfully labeled with the name of liberty. The most of us used to drink it down, and the result was just what might be supposed. Many of us were led to think that there was little to choose between liberty and slavery. We felt, and very properly too, that we had almost as well be slaves to man as to rum. So when the holidays ended, we staggered up from the filth of our wallowing, took a long breath, and marched to the field, feeling upon the whole rather glad to go from what our master had deceived us into a belief was freedom back to the arms of slavery. So they get this week. And the slave masters like it when they just get drunk and act wild. And after a whole week of drinking, and the slave owners, they encourage it. Let's have drinking contests. A whole week of drinking would make you feel horrible. Okay, you guys have heard of hangovers and such. Miserable, awful feeling. And if you just pump these slaves full of whiskey and alcohol for a week, they're going to feel so terrible that, well, you're going to perhaps think maybe freedom's not all it's cracked up to be. Better a slave to a person than to the rum, the whiskey. I have said that this mode of treatment is a part of the whole system of fraud and inhumanity of slavery, and it is so. The mode here adopted to disgust the slave with freedom by allowing him to see only the abuse of it is carried out in other things. For instance, a slave loves molasses. He steals some. His master, in many cases, goes off to town and buys a large quantity. He returns, takes his whip, and commands his slave to eat the molasses until the poor fellow is made sick at the very mention of it. The same mode is sometimes adopted to make the slaves refrain from asking for more food than their regular allowance. A slave runs through his allowance and applies for more food. His master is enraged at him, but not willing to send him off without food, gives him more than is necessary, and makes him eat it within a given time. Then, if he complains that he cannot eat it, he's said to be satisfied neither full nor fasting, and is whipped for being hard to please. I have an abundance of such illustrations of the same principle drawn from my own observation, but think the cases I have cited sufficient. The practice is a very common one. On the 1st of January, 1834, I left Mr. Covey and went to live with Mr. William Freeland, who lived about 3 miles from St. Michael's. I soon found Mr. Freeland a very different man from Mr. Covey. Though not rich, he was what would be called an educated Southern gentleman. Mr. Covey, as I have shown, was a well-trained Negro breaker and slave driver. The former, slaveholder though he was, seemed to possess, and so this is Mr. Freeland, seemed to possess some regard for honor, some reverence for justice, and some respect for humanity. The latter, Mr. Covey, seemed totally insensible to all such sentiments. Mr. Freeland had many of the faults peculiar to slaveholders, such as being very passionate and fretful, but I must do him the justice to say that he was exceedingly free, from those degrading vices to which Mr. Covey was constantly addicted. The one was open and frank, and we always knew where we could find him. The other was a most artful deceiver and could be understood only by such as were skillful enough to detect his cunningly devised fraud. Another advantage I gained in my new master was he made no pretension to or profession of religion, and this, in my opinion, was a truly great advantage. So remember, Mr. Covey was really into religion. What has Frederick Douglass already said about religion and slaveholders? The more religious they are, the worse they are, because they seem to feel like they can find religious justification for beating the slaves and having power over them. Again, as I've stressed before, taking things out of context from the Bible, not really what the Bible promotes, but when you can just pick and choose verses, because you can read, then you can find the ones that say exactly what you want. Mr. Freeland, not religious. I assert most unhesitatingly that the religion of the South is a mere covering for the most horrid crimes, a justifier of the most appalling barbarity, a sanctifier of the most hateful frauds, and a dark shelter under which the darkest, foul, grossest, and most infernal deeds of slaveholders find the strongest protection. So religions like this covering over all the terrible stuff that goes on. Were I to be again reduced to the chains of slavery, next to that enslavement, I should regard being the slave of a religious master the greatest calamity or disaster that could befall me. For of all slaveholders with whom I have ever met, religious slaveholders are the worst. I have ever found them the meanest and basest, the most cruel and cowardly of all others. It was my unhappy lot not only to belong to a religious slaveholder, but to live in a community of such religionists. Very near Mr. Freeland lived the Reverend Daniel Whedon, and in the same neighborhood lived the Reverend Rigby Hopkins. These were members and ministers in the Reformed Methodist Church. Mr. Whedon owned, among other things, a woman slave whose name I have forgotten. This woman's back for weeks was kept literally raw, made so by the lash of this merciless religious wretch. He used to hire hands. His maxim or his belief was, behave well or behave ill. It is the duty of a master occasionally to whip a slave to remind him of his master's authority. Such was his theory and such was his practice. Again, we see Douglass's frustration with religion, and it's a terrible story. It's a man of God, a man of the church, and he's beating his slaves, whether they do good or bad. He's good to remind them of the authority. Mr. Hopkins was even worse than Mr. Whedon. His chief boast was his ability to manage slaves. The peculiar feature of his government was that of whipping slaves in advance of deserving it. Oh, let me whip my slaves before they even did anything wrong. He always managed to have one or more of his slaves to whip every Monday morning. He did this to alarm their fears and strike terror into those who escaped. His plan was to whip for the smallest offenses, to prevent the commission of large ones. Mr. Hopkins could always find some excuse for whipping a slave. It would astonish one, unaccustomed to a slaveholding life, to see with what wonderful ease a slaveholder can find things of which to make occasion to whip a slave. A mere look, word, or motion, a mistake, accident, or want of power are all matters for which a slave may be whipped at any time. Does a slave look dissatisfied? It is said he had the devil in him and it must be whipped out. Does he speak loudly when spoken to by his master? Then he is getting high-minded and should be taken down a buttonhole lower. Does he forget to pull off his hat at the approach of a white person? Then he is wanting in reverence and should be whipped for it. Does he ever venture to vindicate his conduct when censured for it? Then he is guilty of impudence, one of the greatest crimes of which a slave can be guilty. Does he ever venture to suggest a different mode of doing things from that pointed out by his master? Then he is indeed presumptuous and getting above himself, and nothing less than a flogging or whipping will do for him. Does he, while plowing, break a plow, or while hoeing, break a hoe? It is owing to his carelessness, and for it a slave must always be whipped. So he's listing all these examples of how slaves get a beating. There was not a man in the whole county with whom the slaves who had the getting, let me start over, excuse me. There was not a man in the whole county with whom the slaves who had the getting their own home would not prefer to live rather than with this Reverend Mr. Hopkins. And yet there was not a man or anywhere around who made higher professions of religion, or was more active in revivals, more attentive to the class, love feast, prayer, and preaching meetings, or more devotional to his family, that prayed earlier, later, louder, and longer than the same reverend slave driver, Rigby Hopkins. So the worst slave driver of all is the most religious person that Douglass knows. But to return to Mr. Freeland and to my experience while in his employment, he, like Mr. Covey, gave us enough to eat, but unlike Mr. Covey, he also gave us sufficient time to take our meals. He worked us hard, but always between sunrise and sunset. He required a good deal of work to be done, but gave us good tools with which to work. His farm was large, but he employed hands enough to work it, and with ease compared to many of his neighbors. My treatment while in his employment was heavenly compared with what I experienced at the hands of Edward Covey. So things with Freeland are much better. Mr. Freeland was himself the owner of but 2 slaves. Their names were Henry Harris and John Harris. The rest of his hands were hired. These consisted of myself, Sandy Jenkins, and Handy Caldwell. Henry and John were quite intelligent, and in a very little while after I went there, I succeeded in creating in them a strong desire to learn how to read. This desire soon sprang up in the others also. They very soon mustered up some old spelling books, and nothing would do but that I must keep a Sabbath school. Sabbath school is Sunday school. It's church school, church on Sunday. I agreed to do so, and accordingly devoted my Sundays to teaching these loved fellow slaves how to read. Neither of them knew his letters when I went there. Some of the slaves of the neighboring farms found what was going on and also availed themselves of this little opportunity to learn to read. It was understood among all who came that there must be as little display about it as possible. It was necessary to keep our religious matters at St. Michael's unacquainted with the fact that instead of spending the Sabbath in wrestling, boxing, and drinking whiskey, we were trying to learn how to read the will of God. For they had much better see us engaged in those degrading sports than to see us behaving like intellectual, moral, and accountable beings. My blood boils as I think of the bloody manner in which Messrs. Wright Fairbanks and Garrison West, both class leaders in connection with many others, rushed in upon us with sticks and stones and broke up our virtuous little Sabbath school at St. Michael's, all calling themselves Christians, humble followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. But I am again digressing. To digress is to go off on a tangent. And I think you probably all know people like that. You probably know teachers like that. I might even be one of them. They're talking about one thing, and then someone asks a question or something else pops up, and you go off and talk about something else. That's digressing. Okay. Frederick Douglass was starting to talk about the school with Freeland and him teaching the slaves, but he can't keep off of this subject of the religious, hypocritical slaveholders. I held my Sabbath school at the house of a free colored man whose name I deem it imprudent to mention. So imprudent would be unwise, so he won't tell us who this man was. For should it be known, it might embarrass him greatly, though the crime of holding the school was committed 10 years ago. I had at one time over 40 scholars, and those of the right sort, ardently desiring to learn. So he's teaching over 40 slaves. They were of all ages, though mostly men and women, so they were mostly adults. I look back to those Sundays with an amount of pleasure not to be expressed. They were great days to my soul. The work of instructing my dear fellow slaves was the sweetest engagement with which I was ever blessed. We loved each other, and to leave them at the close of the Sabbath was a severe cross indeed. A cross you have to carry is something like a burden. It's really hard to do. When I think that those precious souls are today shut up in the prison house of slavery, my feelings overcome me, and I am almost ready to ask, does a righteous God govern the universe? And for what does he hold the thunders in his right hand, if not to smite the oppressor and deliver the spoiled out of the hand of the spoiler? These dear souls came not to Sabbath school because it was popular to do so, nor did I teach them because it was reputable to be thus engaged. Every moment they spent in that school, they were liable to be taken up and given 39 lashes. They came because they wished to learn. Their minds had been starved by their cruel masters. They had been shut up in mental darkness. I taught them because it was the delight of my soul to be doing something that looked like bettering the condition of my race. I kept up my school nearly the whole year I lived with Mr. Freeland, and beside my Sabbath school, I devoted 3 evenings in the week during the winter to teaching the slaves at home. And I have the happiness to know that several of those who came to Sabbath school learned how to read, and that one, at least, is now free through my agency. The year passed off smoothly. It seemed only about half as long as the year which preceded it. I went through it without receiving a single blow. I will give Mr. Freeland the credit of being the best master I ever had till I became my own master. For the ease with which I passed the year, I was, however, somewhat indebted to the society of my fellow slaves. They were noble souls. They not only possessed loving hearts, but brave ones. We were linked and interlinked with each other. I loved them with the love stronger than anything I have experienced since. It is sometimes said that we slaves do not love and confide in each other. In answer to this assertion or argument, I can say I never loved any or confided in any people more than my fellow slaves, and especially those with whom I lived at Mr. Freeland's. I believe we would have died for each other. We never undertook to do anything of any importance without a mutual consultation. We never moved separately. We were one, and as much so by our tempers and dispositions as by the mutual hardships to which we were necessarily subjected by our condition as slaves. So slaves were very, very close with each other. At the close of the year 1834, Mr. Freeland again hired me of my master for the year 1835. But by this time, I began to want to live upon free land as well as with Freeland. So there we see a pun, a play on words. And I think something so interesting is this book is the names. And the names are factual. Douglass does not change the names. But how interesting that Freeland is the name of his master right now when he's desiring so much to be free. And Mr. Gore was one of the overseers earlier, and Mr. Severe, like Gore for gory, Severe. And I just think it's very, very interesting. But they're all real people, real names. And I was no longer content, therefore, to live with him or any other slaveholder. I began, with the commencement of the year, to prepare myself for a final struggle, which should decide my fate, one way or the other. My tendency was upward. I was fast approaching manhood, and year after year had passed, and I was still a slave. These thoughts roused me. I must do something. I therefore resolved that 1835 should not pass without witnessing an attempt on my part to secure my liberty. So he's not going to let this year go by without trying to escape. But I was not willing to cherish this determination alone. My fellow slaves were dear to me. I was anxious to have them participate with me in this, my life-giving determination. I therefore, though with great prudence or wisdom, commenced early to ascertain their views and feelings in regard to their condition, and to imbue their minds with thoughts of freedom. I bent myself to devising ways and means for our escape, and meanwhile strove on all fitting occasions to impress them with the gross fraud and inhumanity of slavery. I went first to Henry, next to John, then to the others. I found in them all warm hearts and noble spirits. They were ready to hear and ready to act when a feasible plan should be proposed. So some other slaves, when Douglass can create the plan, these other slaves want to escape with him. They were ready to hear and, excuse me, this was what I wanted. I talked to them of our want of manhood if we submitted to our enslavement without at least one noble effort to be free. We're not really men if we don't try this. We met often and consulted frequently and told our hopes and fears, recounted the difficulties, real and imagined, which we should be called upon to meet. At times, we were almost disposed to give up and try to content ourselves with our wretched lot. At others, we were firm and unbending in our determination to go. Wherever we suggested any plan, there was shrinking. The odds were fearful. Our path was beset with the greatest obstacles, and if we succeeded in gaining the end of it, our right to be free was yet questionable. we were yet liable to be returned to bondage. So even if they can escape and get to the north, there's still that danger of being taken back south. Remember the Fugitive Slave Act. We could see no spot this side of the ocean where we could be free. We knew nothing about Canada. Our knowledge of the North did not extend farther than New York. And to go there and be forever harassed with the frightful liability of being returned to slavery, with the certainty of being treated tenfold worse than before, the thought was truly a horrible one, and one which it was not easy to overcome. The case sometimes stood thus. At every gate through which we were to pass, we saw a watchman. At every ferry, a guard. On every bridge, a sentinel. And in every wood, a patrol. So any gate, there's a gateman watching them. Any ferry, like a boat to cross the river, there's a guard there. On a bridge, a sentinel, which is also a guard. And in the woods, a patrol, also a guard. So any method of escape, there's people there to prevent it. We were hemmed in upon every side. Here were the difficulties, real or imagined, the good to be sought and the evil to be shunned. On the one hand, there stood slavery, a stern reality, glaring frightfully upon us, its robes already crimson with the blood of millions, and even now feasting itself greedily upon our own flesh. On the other hand, away back in the dim distance, under the flickering light of the North Star, behind some craggy hill or snow-covered mountain, stood a doubtful freedom, half frozen, beckoning us to come and share its hospitality. Such beautiful imagery there. We get the horrible awfulness of slavery. We've got personification here, a metaphor. Slavery is wearing the robe that's covered in blood of millions of slaves. And then and it's feasting on slaves still, like it's eating the flesh of slaves. So really gross imagery. But then the beautiful imagery of freedom. And it's hidden. It's over a mountain, maybe beneath a crag somewhere, and it's half frozen. It's only half there, but it's out there somewhere. And it's beckoning, it's calling them. When you beckon, you kind of wave and encourage someone to come. Freedom is beckoning to them. This in itself was sometimes enough to stagger us, but when we permitted ourselves to survey the road, we were frequently appalled or shocked. Upon either side, we saw grim death, assuming the most horrid shapes. Now it was starvation causing us to eat our own flesh. Now we were contending with the waves and were drowned. Now we were overtaken and torn to pieces by the fangs of the terrible bloodhound. Those would be the dogs that the slave catchers used to track slaves. We were stung by scorpions, chased by wild beasts, bitten by snakes, and finally, after having nearly reached the desired spot, after swimming rivers, encountering wild beasts, sleeping in the woods, suffering hunger and nakedness, we were overtaken by our pursuers, and in our resistance we were shot dead upon the spot. I say this picture sometimes appalled us and made us rather bear those ills we had than fly to others we know not of. And this is a quote from Shakespeare, okay? So that is from Hamlet, and if you don't know what bad is out there, or if you're scared that it is bad out there, better to suffer the bad that you know than to risk it being even a worse kind of bad. And that whole previous paragraph, that awful stuff happening to them, this is what they're envisioning if we try to escape all of these horrible ways to die could happen. Okay. In coming to a fixed determination to run away, we did more than Patrick Henry when he resolved upon liberty or death. That's the reference to give me liberty or give me death. With us, it was a doubtful liberty at most, and an almost certain death if we failed. For my part, I should prefer death to hopeless bondage. All right, that is where I'm going to stop. Okay. He's getting closer to escaping and convincing some of his fellow slaves to go with him. And we'll finish chapter 10 next time. Thank you for listening.